Okay. Shalom, everybody. Happy Sabbath. To those who keep the Saturday Sabbath, happy Sabbath to you. To all of you who have not, this is maybe your first time logging in or checking us out. I'm Brother King. This is Brother Daryl. Shalom, shalom. We love y'all. We ask that y'all have pen, pads, paper. We're going to go over today indentured servitude versus chattel slavery, right? Talking about the Irish slavery and the myth and the fallacies that's been spread to basically diminish what Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans have been through historically and currently going through today, right? We're going to break down those strongholds and those lies through a thesis paper, right? So first precept that we'll get today, Psalm 73 and verse 8. Psalms chapter 73 and verse 8.
The book of Psalms, chapter 73, verse 8. They are corrupt and speak wickedly concerning oppression. They speak loftily.
They are corrupt and speak wickedly concerning oppression. That's what so-called Edom does, so-called white man does to us, right? Whenever it comes to us and we talk about why we're in the conditions that we're in today and what happened to us historically, right? Anytime we talk about it, they have a need to try and diminish what we went through. They love to bring up black on black crime. Y'all do it to each other. Y'all kill each other. They like to bring up what we're going to talk about today of, we were in slavery as well. We were the first. I've heard they went as far as to say that they were the first slaves actually in America, right? Talking about the Irish indentured servitude, right, versus our chattel slavery. But the thing is, nobody has never went back to, not that I can recall anyway, nor any of the camps that I've watched before. I've never seen anyone do a deep dive into exactly what it was that they went through. And so I decided to pretty much, do my own due diligence and see exactly what it was that they were going through and what it looked like. And compared to what we went through, does it stand up against what we went through? Or is it something, but that's just, they add to it? If it's just something that they just add to, right? So the next precept, James chapter 3 and verse 5. James 3 and 5.
The book of James, chapter 3, verse 5. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth.
Right? How great a matter a little fire kindleth. Why? Because this is symbolic, talking about lies and fallacies. Whenever you start off a lie, and then it continues to pass on to the next person or whatever, now everybody is going to hold fast to that lie. And the lie is that indentured servitude is anything close to chattel slavery, and it's not, right? The so-called white man went through indigenous servitude. Black, Hispanic man, woman, and child went through chattel slavery. We're not going to take a deep dive into the history of so-called Blacks and Native Americans, because we all pretty much know the history, right? But we don't really know the history of the so-called white man pertaining to his indentured servitude. We know the definition, but we don't know what happened in history. So, can you open up that link I had sent you with the thesis paper? You want to send this to you again?
Yeah, you got to send to me. What'd you send to me on
Messenger?
On Messenger?
On Messenger.
Okay.
On our group chat.
Yeah. Get there.
So
get there.
we're going to talk about this thesis paper. So I'm gonna read something for y'all, right? So if anybody ever tries to say that, a thesis paper is not scholarly or whatever, right? You can use a thesis paper. You can definitely use it as a reference of some type of, scholarship or whatever, right? Because a thesis paper, if you Google and ask Google that question, right? Is it resourceful or is it scholarly, right? I looked that up and it says the dissertation and thesis may be considered scholarly sources, right? Since they are closely supervised by a dissertation committee made up of scholars, are directed at a academic audience, and are extensively researched right?
Where you at?
Follow, I'm just reading some on Google to prove
Okay.
that.
I got it here.
Okay, so we're gonna start at just at the very top,
Okay.
right? It says that a thesis paper follow research methodology and are cited in other scholarly work. Whenever we go and we go through this thesis paper, you will see how it's cited, right? So at certain sentences where the author who wrote this, at the end of certain sentences, he has it numbered. He'll have something like the number 8, right? And if you go to the bottom of that same page, on the thesis paper, you go to the bottom of that same page, you will see a number 8, right? And then it'll have off to the right of it where he sourced it from. So you can go back and source and see exactly what he was talking about. Okay. Then it also says a thesis is a type of research paper based on the original research, right? Based on the original research. Now, we're gonna go to the thesis paper at the very top. At the very top, you read the title at the very top of it. Appreciate you.
All right, this is Slaves to a Myth, Irish Indentured Servitude, African Slavery, and the Politics of White Nationalism.
And white nationalism, yep. A thesis presented to the Department of History, University of California, San Diego, by Liam McKee, advised by Mark Henna, PhD, April 2021, right?
Okay.
Now we're going to scroll down to page 1 where it says chapter 1, Irish slave myth. All right, it's page 1, okay? Right there.
All right, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Introduction is, on March 25th, 1659, a petition was read out to the English Parliament as part of its daily business. The petition had come across the Atlantic Ocean from the small island of Barbados, a far-flung English Caribbean colony on the edge of the New World.
Okay, right there. So this thesis is going to be about the small island of Barbados, right? In South America, it's the most westward island in around South America, right? So it's the most westward island, and it's called the island of Barbados. Okay, keep going.
Barbados was no isolated outpost of the empire. However, it was home to several lucrative sugar plantations, a bustling port town, and a population that numbered over 30,000 colonists. Several members of the parliament, already familiar with the island through prior or existing business connections, listened eagerly from their benches, but the petition did not bring good news. It's alleged, a very serious matter, that there were freeborn Englishmen on the island living in a state of slavery.
Right? So that was a problem amongst them, right? Because it's them putting whites in slavery, and within the thesis paper, it's going to ensure, right, using it in politics, in their laws, is going to note that they were making sure that they set a difference between an indentured servant and a slave, a Negro. They make sure that they, differentiated the two. Okay. And so this petition was sent right to the hierarchy, to the head, to the crown, saying that, hey, you have some freeborn so-called white men who are put in slavery, and this is problematic and it goes against the law. Now, the next paragraph, you see, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The sixth line, there's a sentence that starts off that says, they called upon Parliament.
Got it. They called upon Parliament to curb the power of those Barbadian colonists that had subjected the prisoners to being traded between plantation like goods and chattel, sleeping in animal houses, and being whipped at whipping posts. Furthermore, their petition directly compared and likened these indignities to the state of slavery, that something that was, in their view, against their inherent rights as freeborn Englishmen.
So this petition, they were basically entailing that they were being whipped, that they were being starved, etc. And they compared it to the Black slaves who was there, right? That's what this petition that was sent up was talking about. Can you start at the next paragraph on the next page?
Starting at this petition?
This petition.
This petition is one of the first extant primary sources that refers to a concept of white slavery in the Americas. Almost 4 centuries later, sources like the Foyle Rivers Petition are the seeds of a modern white slavery myth that conflates a specific legal state known as indentured servitude, both voluntary and involuntary, with generational chattel slavery imposed upon millions of Africans.
Right. So basically, using that petition, that's basically the source that they use to start the myth to say that their indentured servitude was similar to chattel slavery in which the Africans went through. And again, it said a myth. Okay, it said a myth. Okay, he's do the next paragraph.
Next paragraph.
Since
the turn of the 3rd millennium, this myth seed has been carefully nurtured by the right wing in the United States, who claim that white Europeans, mainly from Ireland, demographically made up the first slaves in America. That hurt my mouth. Are you kidding? You on me, man? Are you kidding on me, bro? Anyway. The myth alleges that white Irish slavery existed in the English Caribbean colonies prior to the arrival of enslaved Africans, that white slaves endured conditions much worse than any African did, and that the general public needs to be educated about this alarming fact, in quotes.
Exactly. This is the reason why we're reading this, right? Because the author also shows and is going to prove, right? So it basically described the myth. That's what it did. It just described the myth and gave the definition of the myth. And it's going to go into where the myth came from, right? But the myth is the important part about this is how they try to compare or make worse their condition than ours, right? Where do we want to go next? We're just going to skip past a bit. Let's go to page 4. We'll go to page 4 and we'll go to that second paragraph on page 4.
Second paragraph on page 4.
The myth works.
The myth works by grounding itself in a nugget of truth. In the 17th century, English Caribbean colonies, African slavery existed hand in hand with a status of work known as indentured servitude.
Now, this is the next sentence is about to explain what indentured servitude is. Now, remember chattel slavery, right? Rigorous bondage, captivity, being whipped, chained, snatched babies, snatched away and taken from their mothers and their fathers and put to another plantation, women being raped, men also being raped and castrated, torture, right? So let's see what an indentured servitude is.
An indentured servant was someone who sold their labor for a fixed period in order to repay the cost of transportation from one location to another, such as a transatlantic voyage from the British Isles to one of the burgeoning Caribbean colonies.
Exactly. So they basically sold their labor, not sold themselves, not put themselves, right, up for auction and stuff like that. It was a sale of services. That's one difference between an indentured servitude, but that is the definition of it. But the difference, right? Because in slavery, you have no choice. You're being sold. You're not putting yourself out there, voluntarily, volunteering your services. You have no choice. It's either you do it or you die, right? Okay, keep going.
Pay cost transaction, house. Okay, indentured servants could be voluntary or involuntarily. That's a weird sentence. Indentured servants could be voluntarily or involuntarily. Many Irish people became indentured servants in the English Caribbean colonies in hopes of finding a new life, or were sentenced to periods of servitude on the island plantations as punishments for committing a crime at home.
Right. So indentured servants, they were either they volunteered their services in their labor or it was involuntary, right? So we didn't want to come to America like that, just up and just come. We didn't offer our services. We were thrown in cages and thrown on ships in chains and brought to America. We didn't have a choice. But these people went there in search of a new life. We didn't, that wasn't in our to-do list. That was not on our to-do list. You
No.
just hop up. We didn't have a choice. Ours was for everyone, it was involuntary. All of it was involuntary. So so it says, so even those, so for those that where it was involuntary, if they were in prison and they committed a crime or something like that, they were, sentenced to serve some time over in Barbados and they would work on the plantations or whatever, right? So we're already seeing a distinction between chattel slavery and indentured servitude. Did we finish? Okay, keep going.
Okay, for the second half of the 17th century, indentured servants and enslaved Africans lived, worked, and interacted on the same plantations. But this does not imply equality of either status or circumstance.
Right, so we was on the same plantation, but we were not equal, right? So indentured servants and African slaves were on the same plantation, but we were not equal, okay?
There was a clear and notable disparity between the daily lives of a slave and an indentured servant.
Mm-hmm.
That disparity was enshrined both by law and in everyday practice on the plantations.
Right. So I'm gonna spoil a little bit. So an example of that was, so in their laws, right? In their laws, to ensure that the so-called white man was not being treated like the Africans, they created a law where basically they ensured that the whites never became slaves. And they were only indentured servants. And they specific, I paraphrased a bit, but they specifically did put whites and Negroes within that law to establish a distinction between the two groups, right? The two groups of service. Yes, the indentured service and the slaves. They put that in their laws, and we're going to get that as well. Can you skip down 3 lines in the middle where it says, but it is entirely accurate?
But it is entirely accurate to conclude that an enslaved person was at the very bottom of society, lower than an indentured servant. Indentured servitude and slavery were two different legal statuses in the 17th century English Caribbean colonies. And indentured servitude enjoyed rights and privileges that slaves did not.
Now, I want to give y'all an example, right? So, of course, slaves are in shackles and chains, and they don't have the right to roam to and fro as they please. Now, as an indentured servant, they did have a right to go down to the other plantation and say, hey, how you doing, to old Bill over there or something like that.
You said
indentured servant. Indentured servants, they had that privilege, you know what I'm saying? They can go and purchase a little bit of tobacco. They can go, you know what I'm saying, put a little dip in, a little cigarette or whatever it is, and they could do that. Slaves could not, right? Not only that, it's going to talk about it later. They actually put the indentured servants, the white man, the Irishman, they put the indentured servants over the African slaves. So according to the thesis, along with the sources in the thesis paper, it says that the Irishman indentured servants were over in Barbados before African slaves got transported to there. Now, once the African slaves got transported to Barbados, to make a distinction between the two, of course, now we have a problem, because at first, but prior to the African slaves getting here, you have the indentured servants who were on the bottom of the food chain. They were on the bottom. They was on the lowest of the low of the social level, right? So once the African slaves came, you couldn't beat the whites the same way you beat the blacks, right? You couldn't do it, because now we're making them equal. So what they would do is make the indentured servants, the white man, they will put them, he's still a servant, but he's on a higher class than the slaves. So, and they made it known. So what they did was, in the plantations, they made sure that the indentured servants were teaching the African slaves and not mentoring them, but instructing them on how to do certain practices as well, how to take the cotton and work with the cotton, or the tobacco, or the sugar canes, right? And the sugar cane fields and stuff like that. They made sure that, there was a distinction, a known distinction between the indentured servants and the slave, okay? So slaves were below the indentured servants, right? On a social level. Now we're going to skip down to page 6. Let's go down to page 6 where it says origins and development of the myth.
Page 6.
Page 6. Where it says in 2000.
Oh, there it is. Or there's the heading. Origins and developments of the myth. In 2000, the book To Hell or Barbados, The Ethnic Cleansing of Ireland was published by O'Brien Press.
Okay, stop right there. Now, if you read through the rest of this paragraph going into the page 7, right, it's going to list off, I want to say about 2 other books. And so in reading those books, it gives a lot of fallacies as far as what the indentured servants actually went through and trying to compare it to what Black people and the African slaves went through in Barbados, trying to compare the two as if they went through they were under the same types of conditions. This is where the origin and development of the myth started from, right? But if you go down to page 7, right? If you go down to page 7, there's on the top paragraph, on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on the 6th line off to the right, it says none of these writers are historians, right? So none of the authors of those books, right? They're not historians. They're only authors, right? And if we have a whole bunch of sources off of this thesis, and we line up source versus source or whatever, and compare the two, 9 times out of 10, they're probably going to use the petition in their books, that petition that we read about earlier, as a source of where the book came from, information from the book came from. But the problem with that petition is it came from 2 people. One was named like Marcus Rivers, and the other one was like Foyle. It came from those 2 indentured servants, right? And if you had those 2 who were being treated in that manner, you're talking about 2 compared to millions of Africans under chattel slavery. So even if those 2 went through something similar, or there we go.
I'm looking at it.
So if they went to anything comparable to what the Africans went through, right? Or even a little bit worse, we're talking about 2 Irishmen. Who gives a damn about 2 Irishmen when there's too many of us? There are millions of us, right? So anyway, none of those authors are historians, right? None of those authors of those books written on page 6 are historians. Now, on page 7, no, we ain't gonna worry about that. We're gonna keep on going. Let's go down to page 10. And on the bottom of the page, on page 10, you have a meme, right? You have a meme. And it's basically just showing the fallacies and the falsehoods being spread through social media. Because social media is of the devil, man.
All praise.
Social media is of the devil.
That's right.
There's so many ways through social media that you can indoctrinate a person, child, people. It's just period. All over the world. It's easy. Just this lesson here, if I just spread it a whole bunch of Christian doctrine or whatever, now it's everywhere. Anybody can access it and see it. And it can be spread, right? Depending on how many likes and shares I get or whatever, anybody can see it. So anyway, page 10, where it says research methodology.
Research methodology. In researching this thesis, it was most important to access as many primary sources as possible, but the kinds of available sources are limited. There are not many extant records left by individual Barbadians regarding their lives and how they lived them. But we are fortunate that one main primary source, Richard Ligon's A True and Exact History of the Island of Barbados, published in London in 1657, does outline the social transformation of the island as the plantations began to take up more and more land at the expense of everyone else.
Right. So he was actually there. He was an eyewitness, and he was like what we would call a journalist today, but back then they called him a diarist or whatever. They called him a diarist back in those times, but today we call him journalist. Okay. Keep going.
This book has been carefully dissected by many scholars, and although Ligon himself does not specifically condemn the institution of slavery, his book is a valuable resource regarding the attitudes of many English colonists towards slaves and indentured servants. He does not lament the conditions that servants had to work in, musing that many plantation owners gave their lives easier, gave their slaves easier lives because of a lifelong slave was considered a more important financial investment than a temporary indentured servant.
Right. So basically, you're going to put so you had the indentured servants who were over there, so-called white Irishmen. He was over there first, and then the African slaves came over to Barbados second. Now, when that happened, remember the definition of an indentured servant is someone who sells their service or their labor for a period of time, and after that period of time, right, they earn something, they get something, they get their freedom along with some land or money or free voyage back to their homeland or something like that. That's what the end goal was for an indentured servant. So anyone who owned an indentured servant, they had, they were losing profit in a way, because at the end of their indenture, they would have to pay them something or give them something. For a slave, once you pay those 20 pounds or however much you pay for that slave, that's it. You don't pay anything else for that slave. That person is a slave from the time they're born and the time that they die. And there's no end goal as far as anything you have to pay them after that. So it was, they would work there with their indentured service. Sometimes they may work longer hours because, of course, you have to give them something towards the end of their indenture. So they will work them harder. Now I go pick another bag of cotton, or now you can work you can work 2 more hours or whatever. Now you can go and wash this and da. Right? So they may have worked them a little bit harder, but their conditions still was not even comparable to a woman.
And understand this: a chattel slave, they owned you, they owned your children and your children's children.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way this was set up.
Mm-hmm.
They owned your generations. Indentured servants did not. They could work off their debt, whatever that is, whether that be criminal debt or financial debt.
Right.
But as chattel slaves, they owned just like a cow. They own the cow, the calf that the other calves may have when they get big. That's the difference.
Exactly. Big difference, right? So we're already seeing a distinction, and we only a couple pages in. Let me see. Where else do we want to go? Where do we stop at? We stopped at his. Okay. Do you see? Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 6th line, on the 6th line where it says plantation owners were. Oh, you was already there. That's what we read.
We're determined to get their money's worth.
Plantation owners work their indentured service harder.
Where do you see that?
On the 6th line from the top. The 6th line from the top where it says plantation owners work their indentured service.
Oh, you on page, which page?
On page 11.
11?
Mm-hmm.
Let me see.
On page 11, 6th line from the top.
6 lines from the top. And then it says plantation owners worked. Okay, plantation owners worked their indentured servants harder, according to Ligon, precisely because their labor was the only available for a fixed amount of time.
Right.
The plantation owners were determined to get their money's worth out of their servants, because at the end of their indenture, the servants became free to resume to live their lives again.
To resume to live their lives again. So they worked them a bit harder than they worked the slaves, because the slaves is there for a lifetime unless they sell them, right? But they're a slave forever. But it makes sense to actually work the indentured servant a bit harder, because at some point in time, you're going to have to give him his 40 acres and a mule and voyage back to his homeland, right? Or some land there on the land of the island of Barbados or whatever, right? So you will work him harder, because at the end of his indenture, you got to pay him something.
But and the key phrase is worked. What does it say? He worked them harder, but at the end of it,
right?
Yeah, he worked them harder. That he worked them, but his living conditions weren't as bad. And he saw the light at the end of the tunnel.
Exactly.
So it's not the same.
Exactly. He had liberty at the end of the day.
And he had liberty. He could see it.
He had liberty.
And it says here, conversely, freedom was only possible for a slave if they were manumitted, which means if they were given away, died, or sold, or whatever.
Exactly. You reading?
It says, This is one of the core arguments that refute the myth that even though slaves and servants may have lived side by side and shared the same work, an indentured servant was able to interact with power in a way that an enslaved person could never hope to do.
Could never hope
Hope to do.
Nope. It was nope. We couldn't do it. Us could not do it. Let's see. Where do we want to go next? Let's go down to page 17. So we're gonna skip around a bit because we're gonna, get to the main points that basically shows the distinctions. Okay. We're gonna get to the main points that show the distinction. So because this is about 50 pages long, and I do not want to read all 50 pages.
From the top.
Yes, sir.
Demographic changes on the plantations. In parallel to the growth of the sugar industry, the arrival of such an influx of enslaved Africans meant that enormous demographic changes were wrought on Barbados. For the first 2 decades of the colony's existence, many tens of thousands of people from Britain and Ireland arrived in the Caribbean colonies, often as indentured servants. A worker who sold their labor for a fixed period, usually between 5 and 7 years, in exchange for the cost of the transatlantic crossing and a job with food and board.
So that sound familiar? 7 years? That 7th year, that year of Jubilee. That sound familiar? They get freedom at the end of the day, man. This is their nation. This is their nation putting, not even putting them volunteering themselves for, this condition, right? They volunteered their services, right? So that they can kind of escape, because there was a period of time in Ireland where there was a war amongst them and the land was being stripped away from the Irish. So they basically, if they were poor, they had nothing. They had their land taken away from them. They had farms and barns. It was basically convenient for them to offer their services for a fixed period of time. And at that 7th year, that 5th, that 5th, that 6th, 7th year, they got something at the end of the day. They always were going to get freedom, but we were not. So, this is already something to put in a toolbox. Anytime someone comes up and say, we were slaves too. Mother, you weren't no slave. You sold your services voluntarily. And if it was involuntary, guess what? You still got sought freedom at the end of the day. So it cannot compare already, right? Just based off of that, even if they were getting beat, whipped, whatever, guess what? They still got their freedom at the end of the day. Only way we were going to get freedom is if we died or so. That was it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can buy your freedom, but guess what? You're gonna whatever.
There's another guy out there talking about there was an Islamic white people slave trade back in the day too. I don't know if you heard of that one, where they were talking about there was an Islamic slave trade that had to do with white folks, and I'm like, yeah, that was a blip on the map.
Wow.
If that was, think about it. Have you ever heard of the Islamic white people slave trade?
No.
Then it really was of no significance.
Right.
It really was of no significance. And even if there was some slavery, there has been slavery across all different types of people across the world. And to that degree, I get it. There has been slavery. There's never been any type of slavery in the history of the planet,
right,
that our people have endured over centuries.
Right.
Centuries.
Right.
And then this brutal chattel slavery of the transatlantic slave trade of African slaves. There's nothing like it, and there'll never be nothing like it. And they're going to have to pay for this.
Exactly. They're going to have this cheat. They're not getting away from this.
They're not getting away from this judgment.
They're getting away from this judgment. Do you see where it says at the end of the indenture?
Got it.
Yes, sir.
At the end of their indenture, these workers were often paid a stipend and or given a parcel of land elsewhere on the island as their own property.
Does that compare to what we went through? Hell no, we didn't get nothing. Keep going.
This made indentured servitude an attractive proposition for all kinds of people from the lower strata of society in Ireland and Britain, especially those displaced in war or as a result of the ongoing colonization of Ireland.
Right.
However, as the demand for more workers in the sugar industry grew, more and more African-born slaves were brought to Barbados to fill those gaps.
Right. Keep going.
By the turn of the 18th century, the number of African Afro-Caribbean people on Barbados had doubled, while the number of white people had halved.
Right. So there was no need, because you're basically losing money whenever you're investing in a indentured servant, because you're going to lose a little bit of land, you're going to lose some money, because at the end they're promised something. That's what it is. It's basically an agreement, a contract amongst two parties, right? A person who's investing in this indentured servant, and a servant who's offering their services. And at the end of the day, in the last year, they are promised something, right? So it made no sense to invest in that when you could just go ahead and buy this lifelong black slave, African slave, who this is no agreement. It's you gonna do this or you gonna die, nigga. That it make more sense to invest in this African black slave than this white indentured servant. So the numbers started to decrease because more African slaves were being bought and less indentured servants were their services was less required.
And
okay?
they were being enriched.
Right.
They were being profited by these African slaves coming in.
Exactly. Now we're gonna go down to page 19. Page 19. Okay. And where it says to achieve these enormous profits.
To achieve these enormous profits, Barbadian planters imported tens of thousands of enslaved Africans to the island, putting them to back-breaking work in sweltering cane fields. When the Africans came to Barbados, however, they joined a significant labor force that was already present in the plantations. These were white people from all over the British Isles, often from the island of Ireland, who were living and working on Barbados under a labor contract known as an indenture.
Right.
In order to further understand the differences between an indentured servant and a slave, we must next examine the status and lives of the former group.
The former group, right? So they basically were walking into what was already like an established plantation and how things were run. So they would have, the plantation owners would have the indentured servants basically training the slaves on how to operate that, whatever that pickaxe, how to operate that machete and get them canes from off that field or whatever.
Pretty good there, bro.
You feel me?
You were swinging that bad,
but they want to hire me now here.
Yeah.
Shit, Esau, I love to put me in that damn field.
Boy, right now.
Let me stop. But they would. They would.
Stop.
Make America great again. Shit. Stop, man. They full of crap, man. They full of crap.
Don't get me started, bro.
Page 20. Page 20.
Okay.
Now, with page 20 at the very top, it's going to talk about someone named Cornelius Bryan. And when we read about him, it's going to talk about his story and how basically he is a ideal, perfect representation of what indentured servants went through, were going to, and how their ends were met, right? When you think of chattel slavery, you think of somebody like, I think of Nat Turner sometimes.
Yeah.
I think of Nat Turner, though the majority didn't revolt, but he was what he would, him. I mean, anybody really that went through that hard, everybody was under the same conditions. Nobody was under, I mean, you got them light-skinned niggas that were house niggas, you had them coons.
Right.
But you probably got to bleep that.
Yeah, I'm about to bleep that. But listen, they probably dealt with some indignities that maybe we don't talk about all the time, because they were the ones that were probably subject to a lot of that.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but yeah.
Salaciousness anyway.
Exactly. So there's not too many of us that we can say, had a positive end unless they ran away and ran to the north and became successful. You know what I'm saying? So yeah.
Okay.
So we're gonna read at the very top.
Chapter 3. Yep. Chapter 3, the Irish in Barbados. In early March of 1686, an Irishman named Cornelius Bryan lay dying in his home on Barbados. He was not as rich as an English plantation owner, but he was quite prosperous by Irish immigrant standards. He was married to a woman named Margaret, who had borne him 6 surviving children. The Bryan family lived in a mansion house, 22 acres, The Bryan family lived in a mansion house on 22 acres of land. It was far more than one man could work alone. So Bryan owned 11 enslaved Africans to assist him in the running and maintaining of his property. When his last will was made on the 12th of March that year, Cornelius Bryan bequeathed all that he owned in life, the house, the land, and the slaves, to his wife and 6 children.
Right.
Yet 30 years prior, Cornelius Bryan was a convicted criminal.
And remind, this is an Irishman now. This is an Irishman.
Okay.
And indentured servant. Keep going.
He had been sentenced to be lashed 21 times and then exiled from Barbados for publicly declaring that he would cheerfully cannibalize any and all Englishmen. Oh, that's his nature.
That's his nature. He saw. Hey,
yeah, I will eat them. Yes.
I'm telling you.
We are sure you
exactly.
We are sure you'll do it.
He got exiled, came back, and as you can see, he was prosperous.
Mm-hmm.
What African, a so-called African slave, could do something like that? No African slave did that, right?
And even they have some, but that is such an anomaly. That would be 1 in a million that's happened to come out of slavery and become prosperous. 1 in a billion, probably.
And compared to them who had plenty, I mean,
because Frederick Douglass was a slave.
Tell me this about Fred. Well, we don't get it. So I
got you.
There was someone who has told me that he was Edom too. I didn't.
I've never heard that.
Never heard that.
I've heard he may have been mixed, but I don't know how mixed.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I don't know. Again,
he was.
He might have been Edom. I don't know. Go ahead.
But okay. So that second paragraph. Wait a minute. 30. His room. Okay. Where it says his return to the island. You see that?
Yeah, his return to the island and subsequent prosperity later in later life, stand in stark contrast to the notion that all Irish immigrants to the Caribbean were a downtrodden and oppressed lot.
Right, exactly. So you see that, it was common for them to basically come out of that and to prosper. The second paragraph.
Says, it must be remembered, however, that the ultimate prosperity of Cornelius Bryan represents an outlier in the broad story of Irish immigrants to Barbados in the 17th century.
Right.
In order to advance its argument that Irish people were akin to or treated worse than enslaved Africans, the myth often exaggerates downward the status of Irish settlers in the early modern Americas.
Right.
It is true to say that Irish immigrants occupied the lower rungs of society, being held in deep suspicion by the ruling planter class, but it is not accurate to suggest that this experience was universal and ubiquitous.
Right.
Before the sugar plantations absorbed all the best land and made indentured servitude obsolete by importing so many thousands of chattel slaves, there were certain avenues of upward mobility for those Irish settlers who were shrewd enough or lucky enough to take advantage of them as Cornelius Bryan did.
Right. We could not come out like Cornelius Bryan did, right? But for them, for the Irish, for the indentured servants, you know what I'm saying? They were promised something at the end of the day. And from there, they can invest and improve whatever it is they have. If they had got some type of, money towards the end, they can buy a piece of land. Or if land was promised to them, they can buy land, or not buy land, but obtain that land and then, turn it into a plantation or whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? So, and then, build up a profit off of that land and then send money to their homeland, to the motherland. We're seeing their worst, what they consider to be the worst conditions they've ever been through and this isn't even all of them as a whole collectively. This we're talking about the Irish, and a few of the Britons. You still have other nations. You have what the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and they were the ones who were actually going and taking the African slaves from Africa and transporting them to and fro. You know what I'm saying? You have other Edomite nations. This is the word white race, whatever. You know what I'm saying? That were not involved in this. Not, the people in America who are talking about white slavery, unless they descend from some Irish, and this isn't even talking about all of the Irish people. These are a select few of the Irish people. This isn't all the nation of Ireland. This isn't all the nation of them. This is a few of them, right? So it's before, I think at most it said they had about 20,000, in between 20 and 30,000, I think it was. Definitely more than 50,000 compared to our millions.
There's a certain, and I'm going to be careful about how I say this. There's a certain faith in this region that will talk about their trek from the East Coast to the West Coast and how badly they were treated between out there coming out here. And I have to, I used to do it, I don't do it anymore. Remind them, you're talking about a few thousand people.
Right.
We're talking 100 million or more.
Right.
African slaves.
Right.
And maybe even 1 million or 100,000 of them during the time that you were moving your behinds from there to here. How many of those people were still enslaved? And how many of those people were still being killed and oppressed? But any discomfort for them, oh, the world's about to fall down around their ears.
Exactly.
Any discomfort, anything. Oh, we were slaves too.
That's what they do.
You weren't, you.
That's what they do. They have to do that. They have to do that to diminish.
All 12 of you.
They have to do that to diminish what we've been.
Yeah, trying to diminish not just diminish what we've been through, what they did.
Right.
What they did this. They did this. Take responsibility for what you did.
Mm-hmm. We've been through it too. We went through slavery, and y'all killing each other. Y'all kidding. I hate that argument.
Well,
I hate the argument.
Here's your tool. Statistic, and you can look it up, the crime, go to FBI.com, whatever. Right. Statistics say people they predominantly kill their own people. White people kill white people, black people kill black people, Asian people kill Asian people. Mm-hmm. That's what, it ain't just black on black crime. You may as well talk about white on white crime, mm-hmm. because whites predominantly kill whites. Mm-hmm. Blacks predominantly kill blacks. Mm-hmm. We don't normally kill, it's not a normal thing for us to kill outside of our racial makeup.
Right.
And we don't commit as many murders.
Yeah, we don't. You have to ask too, where did we get that behavior from as well? I mean, where that originated, because there's bits and pieces and cases or whatever of us doing that or whatever, but you go back and look at when crime rose and when we actually started killing one another.
Let me tell you, what do I always say? We as African Americans, as Native Americans, as Hispanics, we are an engineered people. We are more like Europeans than we are like Africans.
Right.
We are more like Europeans than we are like Africans. Why? Because we were engineered to be like them. We speak like them. We damn near dress like them. We don't talk like that. We don't speak like Africans. We don't speak like the people in the diaspora. We speak like Europeans. I read like a European. I sound like a European. We both read and speak like Europeans. So we've taken on all of their traits. And if we are killing ourselves off, we learn from the best.
Exactly. That's what happens when you rape, rob, and murder, and you take away a nation of people's culture. They adapt to the oppressor's culture.
That's right.
And that's exactly what we did. We adapted and we took on the customs, cultures, and natures of Esau, that devil. Anyway.
I like how you did that. we don't have to say who they are. We just give them the
yeah, exactly. So
just call them Edom.
That's it. I do, man. I'm gonna just keep it like that. Keep it there.
And the caveat is, we know we can't say we hate them all. We just know.
Right.
We just know.
Exactly. So now, let's see. Let's go to verse. I said verse. Page 21 at the very top.
Irish people had been coming to Barbados since the 1620s.
Okay, that's all I wanted from that right there. Now we're gonna go down to we're going to the third paragraph. Just to show that they had been coming, the Irish people had been going to Barbados since 1620 as indentured servants. Okay, so 1620. Okay. And then they said, then what, the first African slaves actually came to America in 1614, right? It was 1614, 1614, 1618, one or two. So for them to say like, hey, we came to the Americas first as slaves or indentured servants, whatever, that's a lie. Because we were here in, some say 1611, I know for sure 1614. Anyway.
In Ireland, the plantations displaced many thousands of individuals and families, creating a surge of destitute Irish people stripped of their property. Many of these people chose to take whatever they had left and cross the Atlantic in search of a new life. It is difficult to put an exact figure on the numbers of Irish people who came to Barbados in the first half of the 17th century, but it has been estimated that by 1650, there were about 30,000 white people living on the island, the vast majority of them, of whom came from the British Isles.
Right. So from the sixth, so they first started. Remember the first paragraph said that the Irish people had began coming to Barbados since 1620s, right? So let's just say 1620. Then it said by 1650. Brother Strickland corrected me. He said it was 1619. Okay, cool. So we was here a year before they actually started going to South America. All praise. So by 1650, there were about 30,000 white people living on the island, the vast majority of whom came from the British Isles. Okay, keep going.
Where are we at?
21 at the very bottom where it says before 16.
Okay, before 1680, over half of all Irish immigrants went to the Caribbean in part of the in part because of anti-Catholic sentiments in New England. Ligon, our contemporary source, reckoned that at the time he was writing in 1650, there were over 50,000 people living on Barbados, not including enslaved Africans.
Not including enslaved Africans. Okay. So the number of them increasing, basically there was war in Ireland and a lot of them was getting their possessions, property, land stripped away from them, right? And so they started-
By England, right.
By England, yep. And they started moving off into, in search of new life, and they went to Barbados. Okay.
Indentured, you want to read that?
Yes, sir.
Indentured servants. 3/4 of Irish immigrants to the Caribbean colonies came as indentured servants. An indentured servant was someone who sold their labor for a fixed period of time in exchange for the cost of passage and for bed and board at the destination.
So by now, we should already know what indentured servitude is.
Right.
By now, by definition, okay?
Right. We keep going. Indentured servitude was not necessarily working in the sugar fields of the Caribbean colonies. It could involve working aboard a ship for several seasons, for example, but it did usually involve some kind of reciprocal relationship between parties engaged in the indenture.
That's what we were talking about earlier, basically, like a contract or agreement. You know what I'm saying? I get something for this, and between two parties, we agree on something, right? Keep going.
It was also not unheard of for someone to indenture themselves in return for learning a trade.
Damn.
You were a slave, okay. Oh, Lord in Christ. As well as the cost of passage, the indentured servant bound for the sugar plantations on Barbados could also expect their contract to include some kind of bonus payment when it eventually ended.
Ain't that crazy? See, did we get that? This is something also to point out to the so-called devil who says, Idumea, who says that what we went through, see, our conditions were just alike. No, motherfucker, you got bonuses on holidays, on Christmas or whatever. Hell, I was sold for the bit of. Never mind, keep on.
In land, in animals, in coin, as a means to help them settle elsewhere on the island, and thus keeping the colony going.
Look at here. So we went through the same exact thing.
Do you think they even gave them slaves?
Yes. I believe they gave them slaves.
I'm not seeing that in there, but tell me that they didn't give them slaves.
I bet they gave them slaves. I will put money. If I read more in depth, I probably would have passed them like that. Or if I were to go and research one of these sources that is sources on here, I guarantee I will find somewhere where it says
this. I'm going to say that this was an oversight, but you can't tell me that they did not give. They gave them land, animals, and coin, but then
Did not give them
and they not give them some slaves.
It said Cornelius Bryant had 12 slaves. It said earlier, we read up above, I forgot what page it was. Cornelius Bryant it said he had 12 slaves. He had some cattle and everything else. And when he died in his will, his wife and his children inherited all that he had.
We read that. We read
So
that.
12 slaves went to his kids. That sucker had slaves, man. They had slaves. Now, let's go to page 23. And we're going to read the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the 7th line, where it says, to argue this is not semantics.
To argue this is not semantics. It is one thing to buy a human being, body and soul, to do with as you will, but quite another to buy the labor of another person who is possessed of inherent rights and protections under the law for a fixed period of time. Indentured servants had the right to sell their labor, and many did so voluntarily.
Right.
The two forms of commodification of human beings, servant and slave, were very different. I don't think I've ever said commodification.
Modification. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever read that.
Right. So you see obvious difference, right? A servant, they offer their services. They're, offering their labor, offering their services for a fixed price or whatever it is that agreed upon amongst the two parties. A slave, you have no choice, my boy. There is no end goal for you other than death. There's no one to come and save you. There's no legal document that you can lean on as some form of protection or to, give you some type of salvation away from that captivity. There was nothing. So now when we read the next paragraph, what it says, voluntary indenture.
Voluntary indenture. To many people displaced by war or colonization, selling themselves to indentured servitude was an attractive proposition. It gave them a new start in an established colony far from home and promised the ownership of new property upon completion of the contract.
So this was something to look forward to. You know what I'm saying? This was something to look forward to. See, they wanted to start a new life, right? And receive something on the latter end of their indenture. This was something that we did not have. So remember, pull these things right for you. You know what I'm saying? Put them up under your tool belt whenever you're going to bat with someone who says that we were under the same conditions. Well, Edom says that we were under the same conditions that you were. So stop complaining. Shut your mouth and stop complaining. We made it out while you couldn't.
Well, this is the reason why.
This is right.
This is what do they call that? When they have money, generational money.
Yep, generational wealth.
Yep, there it is.
There you go.
There was always a demand for workers right from the beginning of the colony, and the Barbadian planters were not shy about petitioning Parliament for more whenever they started to run short.
Right. Okay. Now we're gonna go down to the next page and read at the very top.
The transatlantic crossing would not have been easy. The average voyage took between a month and 6 weeks.
I don't know why they just say 2 months.
Yeah, it's really weird. Month and 6 weeks, and certainly all the hazards of being cooped up in a close quarters with many other people. Sickness, disease, frayed tempers were present, alongside the dangers of the ocean storms. Janet Shaw, an 18th century diarist, traveled in 1774 from Scotland to the West Indies on a ship full of immigrating indentured servants.
Right.
She was shocked at how little food they had to eat and the conditions they had to live in, remarking, "It is hardly possible for human nature to be so depraved as to treat fellow creatures in such a manner for so little gain."
Right.
However, the ocean crossing for these indentured servants was not the same for the enslaved Africans, who had to somehow survive being tightly chained to wooden planks, so that free movement was almost impossible, coupled with the strong chance of being isolated from family or familiar cultural groups.
Right. So when they're on the bottom of that doggone ship, they're in close quarters, but not in chains and barred and laid across.
They're a little hungry.
Yeah, look, I mean, at most, you know
They're a
what I'm
little
saying?
hungry.
They may eat their own feces or whatever, but that's Esau, you know. That's Esau, and that's how they operate. But still, even a 2-month voyage, it still didn't compare to what we went through. Our sisters were menstruating, on themselves, having babies on ships with no medical care or attention or, a way to get assistance. You know what I'm saying? Like, those are the things that we went through. And we also had sickness, disease, and frayed tempers and fights and wanting to kill each other. And, they still can compare to us, man.
No.
Let's see. Where do you see where it says on the next line where it says, however, no, I'm sorry. On the third paragraph, so I'll go down to the third paragraph, where it says working on a sugar plantation.
Working on a sugar plantation was no easy life. Those Irish indentured servants that survived the ocean crossing to Barbados could look forward to long days under the hot sun, coupled with the possibility of poor living standards. As we saw in the Rivers Foyle petition, many plantation owners treated their indentured servants very badly. Ligon, too, noted that a servant's lot was usually dependent on the whims of their master.
Right.
If the masters be cruel, he wrote, the servants have very wearisome and miserable lives. It was noted by an anonymous writer in 1667 that many indentured servants, Irish people among them, were at work in the parching sun without shirt, shoe, or stocking.
Oh wow, it's so terrible.
That's horrible.
That is the worst living. That is the worst work conditions ever been.
Freaking horrible, yo. Protests and working conditions could result in brutal beatings, something that Ligon claimed to have witnessed personally. But he also noted that at the time of his memoir, the lives of servants were becoming better. Discreeter and better-natured men were, in his opinion, coming to rule Barbados, increasing the quality of food, clothing, and housing being given to the island's indentured servants.
So the Negro just sitting back like, must be nice.
Must be nice.
Must be nice, sir.
It's hot out here.
It must be nice. You know what I'm saying? He said that, it got a little better. Quality of food. We got some clothes. The shoes might have had a hole in the bottom of, but guess what? Hey, they operated. It was better than having
they was getting their ass towed up, but they signed up for it though.
Exactly. It was voluntary.
They signed up for it.
It was voluntary.
All right.
And if it was involuntary, it was a sentence. They got sentenced to this condition.
There's no hope at the end. There's no light at the end of the tunnel.
There's no light in the tunnel for us.
All right. In involuntary indenture. Not all Irish people came voluntarily, of course. Like 19th century transportation to Australia, it was possible in the 17th century to be Barbadosed. That is, sentenced to a period of servitude on one of the English Caribbean islands.
That's what we were just talking about, being sentenced.
Prior to the 1640s, most Irish immigrants to Barbados were voluntary indentured servants. But in the aftermath of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, that sounds like some stuff from HBO,
right,
that centered around the two English civil wars of the 1640s, thousands of defeated prisoners of war were Barbadosed. About 12,000 of them were Irish soldiers or clansmen who had fought on the losing side. And it seemed that the plight of these men forms the initial core of the Irish slaves myth, being a focus of the aforementioned O'Callaghan book, To Hell or Barbados.
Right. So right there. So as y'all can see, so in that book, it talks a little history about what happened during that war and the downfall of those soldiers and how they end up being Barbadosed. And that was the beginning of the myth, talking about how their conditions were equal or worse than ours. Okay. Next paragraph.
Where we at?
It was not.
There we go. It was not just prisoners of war who came involuntarily either. Those guilty of crimes at home could be sentenced to transportation to the Caribbean islands for a duration of time, long or short. In October of 1654, the English Council of State recommended that all English, Scottish, or Irish prisoners in Dorchester jail be Barbadosed or sent to New England colonies.
Right, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so there we go with our involuntary. Now, can you read the next paragraph?
The mid-17th century also saw an epidemic of child kidnappings in Ireland. As startling as it sounds, thousands of young Irish children were kidnapped, put aboard ships, and brought to the Caribbean colonies as involuntary indentured servants. This abhorrent practice does not seem to have been confined to the Caribbean either.
Right.
Records exist of licenses issued to merchants on both Old and New England for the transportation of hundreds of Irish children, indicating widespread forced relocation.
There you go. So there you go. There you have it, where it describes the involuntary servitude, right? You got children that was kidnapped. I'm sure, maybe men.
And this is all bad stuff.
Right.
It's all bad stuff.
Right. It's bad stuff.
It's bad stuff.
But but when we're comparing and contrasting with the slavery, chattel slavery of blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, it doesn't compare at all.
It pales.
We went through.
Pales.
But guess what? When those
Pun
people-
intended.
Right. When those people got off those ships and got there, they may have been beat, they may have been slapped around a bit, may have been whipped, but did they ever get killed? I don't. I just,
And even if they did, it's not anywhere near the
right.
atrocities. There's no way to even compare it.
Right.
No way.
If they got beat, they maybe have been beaten to death. Right. They may have been beaten to death, but we were lynched for no reason. We were lynched because we was found a yard outside of our plantation in the
Or
middle
get
of
your
the
foot
night.
cut off,
Get your foot cut off, castrated,
castrated.
butt broken.
Man raped,
Exactly. Tied, each limb tied to a horse, shot a gun in the air.
drawn and
horses
quartered.
first.
That's called being drawn and quartered.
Look at that. So I'm reading this, and we're reading the history, and you can see that the author is even giving them some, or even trying to give them a nugget or two, but it still doesn't compare.
It doesn't.
It still doesn't compare. It doesn't. Let's see. Where we gonna go next? Page 27. I'm gonna read a little bit
Okay.
so I can give you a little, because we read a lot.
I'm here to read.
Yeah, to read. You cool with it?
Yeah, I'm cool
Okay.
with it.
Page 27, that paragraph where it says that there were numerous incidents. It's like the first
27.
page 27.
Oh, I'm on the wrong page. That'll do it. There were numerous incidents of this antipathy toward Irish settlers. In 1657, police constables on Barbados were being instructed to whip any Irish man or woman who was found wandering the island and not working on a plantation. One Francis Sampson, writing a letter in June 1666 to his brother John regarding an English attack upon the then French colony of St. Kitts, lamented that the Irish were always a bloody and perfidious. I've never read that before.
Perfidious.
I have to look that up.
These are two words.
They were always a bloody and perfidious people to England Protestant interests, because Irish soldiers conscripted for the action proved less than enthusiastic in their duty to the crown.
Right, because they were revolting in a way. Hey, Irishman or indentured servant, go over there and do da 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 da. He was a warrior at one point. He was a soldier. He fought in the military for the freedom of his people at one point. And so going from that, it's a direct servitude, right? To the oppressive people, of course. So now they are kind of passing around a letter or a petition and telling all the plantation owners, you catch them, they slacking, they trying to revolt a bit, you know what I'm saying? Beat some submissiveness into them, right? Okay, keep going.
The next year, the governor of Barbados, Lord Willoughby, grumbled that although there were 2,000 Irish fighting men on the island, he would much prefer Scots instead of them. 30 years later, as yet, another rebellion engulfed Ireland in the wake of the Glorious Revolution in England. Warnings were sent from London to the governors of the English Caribbean colonies regarding the possibility of Irish settlers revolting.
Right. So they're about to, he kind of warning them that they're possibly going to revolt. Now we're going to jump to the next paragraph. Where it says in June. Yeah.
Got it. In June 1660, the Council of Barbados held a meeting in which it was decided to use the militia to count the exact number of Irish people on the island for the purposes of weeding out turbulent, dangerous spirits.
So now they're getting scared. They're like, wait a minute now. They starting to grow a bit. We done took some of these soldiers and brought them over here and put them in indentured servitude.
Mhm.
These suckers can fight. They're, what is it? What the word? Perfidious?
No, perfidious.
Perfidious.
They were
They're
bloody and
perfidious
perfidious.
and violent. You know what I'm saying? So we need to, let's number and see how many of them it is and how many of us it is in case they revolt. We're able to basically defend ourselves. You know what I'm saying? 16. Okay. Next page where it says suspicious of Irish settlers.
Okay, it starts up here. The aforementioned governor of the island, Lord Francis Willoughby, deeply suspicious of the Irish settlers, writing in September 1667 that he did not feel secure on Barbados because of the strange composition of blacks, Irish and servants.
Right, he was scared.
He was scared. He wrote numerous letters back to London and complained so much about the quality of settlers in Barbados that a council of foreign plantations reported that the colony seemed to be in an ill condition in regard of the multitude of Negroes and Irish.
Right.
This is where they try to make this correlation between Irish people and black people. And you're not black.
Exactly.
Knock it off.
You're not. And we still didn't go through the same exact thing.
No.
Now we're going to read in the center of page 20 of the next paragraph. You will see from this paragraph, you'll see from the top of that paragraph is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Starting the seventh line from the top paragraph, it says the Irish generally perceived as disloyal. The Irish generally perceived as a disloyal fifth column might well choose to join the revolt, so needed to be elevated above it and differentiated from the influx of enslaved Africans. This led to a rethink on the part of the authorities. They treat Irish settlers with less of a heavy hand, given that they might be useful to keep ballooning numbers of slaves in line. Indeed. Right. So now at this point, it's like, okay, wait a minute. We've been a little bit too harsh on the indentured service, kind of similar to the slaves, and now there's a override. We're outnumbered. So now we have to come up with some sort of strategy in order to keep both in line, right? In order to keep both of them in line, what is it that we can do in order to keep them both in line? Now, we're going to skip it. We'll go to the next page and read at the top. Verse 20. Let's keep saying verse. Page 29, we'll read at the top. As became the case in the United States in the 19th century, the ruling class began to pit the Irish indentured servants against the enslaved Africans. Right. So right there. So they're starting to put them against them because there was a small period of time where it was kind of like, yo, we kind of getting sick of this, man. They being oppressive as a mug. Look at here. So, and they're thinking that a revolt is coming. They're plotting, right? Those that we have in servitude, they're plotting against us. So now, this is what we have to rethink. Let's pin these against them, kind of how they did the Native Americans versus us and the Hispanics, really the Hispanics. The Hispanics in us, they've turned us against one another, right, to fit their agenda that way. Because if you think about it, with the power and the people and the mindsets that we have as so-called African Americans and Hispanics, if we came together, pulled our resources and together, hell, we have another Wall Street. You didn't know? We'll have another Wall Street. So the same thing here, even though us and Irish, we're not the same people, but it's their condition kind of became a bit harder, not similar to us, but a bit harder. So they were also, kind of owned over rigorously. So they had to basically change the social levels of the two. And they pinned them against us, right? What we at again? It says enslaved Africans, placing them in a social position higher than the slaves, but lower than the plantocracy themselves. Right. Keep going. Allowing the Irish a modicum of social standing and the ability to perhaps better one's fortunes, such as Cornelius Bryan was able to do, would have been a powerful psychological ploy to ensure. Although Irish indentured servants might well be unhappy with their own individual station, they were also aware that they were held in higher esteem than an enslaved person was. Now, what does that do? That sounds like a house person to me. Because they pinned the so-called, in our chattel slavery, If you were of a lighter skin, you'd be in the house. And what does that do psychologically? That puts you in a different social class, right? From those field Negroes being a house Negro. You know what I'm saying? You even have a different privileges. You might be able to ride massa around in the town real quick and come back. Something that the field Negroes would never be able to do. They would never be able to do that. Yet you're still in servitude. It still psychologically makes you feel as if you are better than them. Not knowing that they'll kill you same way they'll kill those field Negroes. Didn't make, let's see. And those privileges as well, right? So like those privileges, that was just one privilege as far as just being able to go in town, take massa in town, come back. That's a privilege, right? And that's something that the field they were never able to do. So again, it was all psychological to keep that revolt from happening because they knew they'd be outnumbered. Now, being that they dangled that little gift to the Irish servants, right? If there was ever a revolt, the Irish servants would turn against the Africans and they wouldn't work together to override the oppression or the oppressors, basically. So basically for the plantocracy, as they called it in the thesis paper, it basically was a defense for them, right? So anyway, where was we at?
We were here, we were at,
This would have made sense to Irish servants.
so this would have made sense to the Irish. So this would have made sense to Irish servants too. They would likely have felt they had more in common with other white European settlers than with enslaved Africans. And from the English perspective, kept the British on Barbados in useful limbo. They occupied a level not high enough to wield any political power or influence,
Right.
but not low enough to not bear some moral weight for the dehumanizing position that African slaves lived in,
Right.
and thus suffer potential consequences in the event of a slave revolt. This is another strong counter argument to the myth that the Irish were slaves. They simply did not exist in the same social level as enslaved Africans.
There we go. There we go. That's something else to put into the you know what I'm saying, the toolbox.
When you go down, Irish slaves could be beaten to death legally.
Right, could be beaten to death legally. And guess what? That's also propaganda and a fallacy as well. Because the thing that I'm telling you, it's what they call meme scholarship.
It's
Meme scholarship. They weren't slaves, they were indentured servants. So there was laws that protected them, in which so them making this meme, they didn't research that. There was laws protecting the indentured servants. And we're gonna get it, it's gonna be
well, read the caption under it. It says another use of a photograph to push an absurd claim. It says right under the picture, the Irish people were not slaves, and indentured servants had inherent rights under English law.
right.
It says here, no indentured servant, Irish or not, could be legally beaten to death,
Right.
although they could be executed if found guilty of a crime, but that's for any crime. That's criminal.
Right. Exactly.
Guilty of a crime that warranted such a sentence. That's just called capital punishment.
That's it. That's it. That is it. So look at that, man. That's the propaganda. That's false. That's false, man. We're gonna go down to page 33. We're gonna go down to page 33. Hopefully y'all are jotting this, even if not jotting it down, taking notes off to the right or whatever. That way you're able to, study it. And I mean, because really right now we're pulling all of the key information from this. Everything else is kind of like a little bit extra, but we're pulling the key information to quickly make a distinction between servitude and chattel slavery. We're going down to page 33, where it says chapter 4, slaves and servants. Page 33, where it says chapter 4, slaves and servants.
As discussed above, a great influx of enslaved African arrived on Barbados during 1640, drawn by the twin evils of unregulated proto-capitalism and mammon. This one is right. I had never the actual specific date they arrived in the Caribbean is unclear, but Portugal and and Spain brought enslaved Africans to the Americas quite early in their colonization effort.
Right.
By no means was the English use of slave labor in their 17th century colonies a novelty.
Right.
There were a small group of enslaved Africans among the first colonists of Barbados in the 1620s.
Oh, wait. So, okay. So Brother Strickland, he said in the group chat, he said, you know, it was 1619 where the first slaves were brought to the Americas. Now it says here in the 1620s that a small group of enslaved Africans among the first colonists of Barbados in 1620s. So exactly when the first colonists or the Irishmen or whoever came there as well, there was also slaves with them. So for them to even say that they were the first slaves in the Americas, this is a cut.
That's a cut.
It's a cut.
The white meat cut. Where we at? It says there were a small group of enslaved Africans among the first colonists of Barbados in 1620, and over the ensuing decades, their numbers swelled dramatically. By 1655, there were over 20,000 enslaved Africans on the island. In December 1667, an anonymous source estimated the number of enslaved people to be over 50,000. These enslaved people, I think there were not 50,000 indentured servants, I can tell you that.
Right.
These enslaved people were put to work in the growing sugar plantations, living alongside and interacting with Irish and other indentured servants on a daily basis.
Right.
There was no way they could have done so. There was no way they could have done so.
Could not have done so.
Excuse me. There was no way they could not have done so. The new plantation slaves needed to be shown where to cultivate and harvest a sugar cane.
Right.
Instructed how to work the
Ingenio.
machine, and needed experience in the fine art of boiling the juice in the coppers.
Right. So when they are going there, this is what the indentured servants were actually teaching the slaves how to do. Because remember, we already established that there was a difference on the social levels. So now as the slaves are coming in, the duties and responsibilities of the indentured servants is to train and instruct the slaves on how to carry out their daily tasks and duties or whatever. And their jobs was basically to just supervise, basically. Okay. Now we're going to jump down to where it says this was not. Oh yeah, that's what it was at anyway. This was not something which could have. This is the fifth line from the top. This was not something.
On page what page?
34.
Oh, here we go. I lost my spot. That's right here. Is Prentice Realize?
You see what I said on the fifth line from the top where it says this was not something which could have been done in a vacuum. On page 34.
The plantation existing white labor force would have been used to teach and later to oversee the coerced efforts of the newcomers plotting into the middle ground between planter and slave. And it was increasingly happening all over the Caribbean.
Exactly. So they were coerced of the newcomers basically to supervise and overlook and teach them and to oversee. Right. So now we're going to jump down the page where it says distinction in daily working life.
These primary sources often mention servants and slaves in the same breath, but again, this does not imply, and we do not infer, any kind of parity between the two groups. Always a distinction between the two remains. If indentured servants were not held in higher esteem than slaves, it is likely that a generic word, slave or servant, might be used to refer to them. Instead, sources are definite. A servant was not the same thing as a slave. And was written in contemporary sources as being distinct from one.
Right.
Servants were often referred to as such, or by their nationality, or in religious terms as Christians.
Right.
Slaves were invariably reduced to their race or skin color.
So again, we see a difference in how they addressed us and how they acknowledged us. A N-word, Negro, slave, what they called it, hey servant. or Christian or whatever it was, right? They addressed us different. Okay.
The distinction was not confined to the Caribbean either. As slavery spread all across the New World, it became the basis for colonial economies. Local governments had to come to terms with the tilting demography between indentured servants and slaves. In 1661, the Assembly of Barbados sent a letter to the Council of Foreign Plantations complaining that that the price of sugar was decreasing even as the cost of servants, Negroes, cattle, horses, and dry goods had doubled.
Right.
In 1663, the Assembly of Maryland passed an act entitled Concerning English Servants that ran away in the company of Negroes or other slaves. In 1665, a bounty was put out by the governor of Jamaica against rebellious slaves on the island, declaring that any servant or slave bringing in one of these Negroes shall be free.
You shall be free. Bring them in. You bring them in, you get your freedom.
The many ways for the indentured servant to get his freedom was to bring in a slave.
Bring in a slave. You get your freedom.
Oh, Lord in Christ.
Look at that.
These all indicate a distinction between slave and servant, not only in colonial law, but also in daily life, in daily colonial life.
Now we see, now if you was a slave and you brought a slave, like later on, you brought your slave back, good boy. You get a little bill, get the rest of the day off, go home and chill, kick your feet up, sip some martinis, do what you do. Bring your ass back here with that cotton bag and pick 400 pounds of cotton next morning.
That's what you gonna do.
That's what you gonna do. But anyway, next paragraph.
As the 17th century continued, slavery boomed on Barbados in response to the labor needs of the sugar economy. Opportunities for indentured work were dwindling fast as planters reduced the numbers they took on, and European settlers that were not so many, there were not so many prospects on Barbados after their term was concluded.
Right, so there wasn't much land or property, like the demand for indentured servants were decreasing, and the need and demand for slaves were increasing. And then a lot of them started to realize in this time period, as the 17th century began to go on, that there's not much land and property and stuff that to be given to them because it was starting to be more populated. And okay, keep going.
The most viable farming land had been swallowed up by the plantations, and many indentured servants began to look elsewhere for opportunities, including the 13 colonies, which was over here.
Right.
The Barbados Assembly faced with a stark population differential between black and white, began to cast ideas around to keep as high as possible the number of white people living on the island and who could also be employed in gainful work.
Okay,
that's different than indentured servitude. That's gainful work.
Exactly. Very different. Okay. Very different. Now, we're going down to page 36, and we're going to read the second paragraph.
There is this saying, there is a saying that death ends all tyrannies. Unless they escaped, died, or were manumitted, a slave was a slave for life.
But indentured servitude, indentured servant wasn't an indentured servant for life.
Right.
But we were a slave for life. We were born into it. We're going to die a slave. Okay.
There we go. If they were permitted to marry on the plantation, it was only to another slave. If that marriage produced children, then those children were born into, I told you that. Then those children were born into the state of slavery, and all of them, mother, father, child, down through generations. I just said it. Could be bought or sold like cattle in a market.
Just said that.
This was absolutely not the case for indentured servants whose contracts specified a time limit on their indenture.
They had a time limit and a promise. There was an agreement. They would get something on the end, on the latter days of their indenture. Okay. Are we going to jump down to let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth line from the bottom. There's a sentence that starts off, it says, 3 years later.
3 years later, in the first week of March, 1636, the arrival of a new governor on the island, Robert Hunt, necessitated the hiring of 20 servants by the Providence Island Company to be dispatched to Brookhouse, the governor's seat. Less than a week later, 8 more servants were hired, their provisions and clothing paid in advance by the company for a period of 4 months.
4 months. Okay.
The language is clear. Servants and slaves were two distinct groups and were named as such in the correspondences regarding them. No slave would ever have been hired under terms like these indentured servants were. Slaves were bought and sold as human chattel, but it was the labor of the servants that was for hire,
Right.
often for a fixed period of time, often for fixed periods of time under a contract of employment.
Under a contract of employment. There was no contract amongst us. It was just go work, nigga, and then that was that. Right. I'm reading a little bit, bro. Now we're gonna read verse, man. Page 37, where it says the lost humanity of enslaved Africans. It says Europeans often indulge in outright hypocrisy to justify their enslavement of Africans. Some, like Juan Jeans de Sepulveda, in his famous public debates with Bartolome de las Casas, and embraced the Aristotelian viewpoint that some human beings were natural-born slaves. De Sepulveda made his argument regarding the indigenous peoples of New Spain, blending it with the Catholic theology, but it would have been an easy matter to make the mental connection between the enslaved Native Americans and enslaved Africans. Other Europeans broadly accepted a variant, more secular rationale. Since warfare was endemic among Native Americans who sold their enslaved persons to European buyers, then it was reasoned the Europeans themselves were not enslaving anyone, which was a damn lie.
Damn lie.
That was a lie, man. A straight up lie. It says they were simply purchasing a commodity, and by doing so, were ensuring that the slaves remained alive to have children and thus propagate themselves and not disappear from the earth. In this line of thinking, Europeans absolved themselves by simply abrogating the sin. Later in history, the curse of Ham was linked with West Africa.
Well, that's what the LDS do.
Yep. Oh, yep, they do. Yep. In their book.
Them and Cain.
Right. In their book. Stupid. Giving a biblical justification for the enslavement and forced transportation of Africans to the Americas. In his memoir of life on Barbados, Richard Ligon wrote of several encounters he had with an enslaved African, Sambo, a man who Ligon described as ingenuous, as honest, and as good-natured a poor soul as ever wore black or eat green. Now he's going to write about this slave. Remember, Ligon, we worried about earlier, he's like one of the primary sources because he was one of the people who were over there, right? Read about him earlier, and in his book and in his writings. Now, notice how when his interaction with this slave named Sambo, notice how whenever he goes to do a favor for Sambo, how he's turned down due to the color of his skin, right? Is crazy. It's really weird. I'm gonna read. So it says Samba asked Ligon, right? So the second line, it says Samba asked Ligon. Samba asked Ligon if he could convert to Christianity. And Ligon approached the master of the plantation to see if it was possible. The conversation that followed was an example of European cognitive dissonance. Knowing that Christianity prohibited the enslavement of other Christians, the plantation master refused to allow Sambo to convert because he would then be forced to free him. And a precedent would have been set whereby other slaves might have done the same. Sambo could never be baptized. His soul was rejected in order to make sure he would always and forever remain a slave. So Christians deny other people access to salvation and access to Christ, right? Because according to their doctrine, their theology, they weren't able to enslave.
I mean, they definitely changed that and found another way to enslave us. They definitely changed that. They found another way to enslave us.
Using the scriptures, using
Oh
Paul
no,
writing.
you can't be a. Oh wait. Yeah, you can.
Right.
You can. You're
Hey.
right. But this is what we're gonna teach you a bunch of nonsense though.
I'm telling you. What was it? What's that verse? Slaves obey your masters as if it's the Lord.
Yeah.
In Colossians, I think it's in Colossians or whatever. They definitely they switched that and they used that all the way, man.
They damn sure doing a whole 180 on that
I'm
one.
telling you. Paragraph 2, it says on page 38, paragraph 2 on page 38. It says Sambo's treatment was surely not an isolated case. His desire to move closer to the world of the white settlers might well be interpreted by a modern reader as genuine. Ligon later writes of Sambo betraying a plot by other slaves to sabotage the plantation's boiling house.
Coon. Coon ass nigga. Worthless. The hell.
Oh man, he snitched.
He is a Sambo.
He snitched.
He is a
A
Sambo.
Sambo. Hey, that's a new word for cool. Sambo.
No, that's what they call them.
That's what they call him? I ain't know
Yeah,
that.
bro. That's what they call.
That's
They
what-
call coons and Sambos. If anybody ever called you a Sambo before and you didn't react to it, they was calling you a coon. Yeah, bro.
I've never heard that
That's
before.
probably where this word came from.
I've never heard that. Bruh.
Wow. Yeah, man.
Okay, that's
When
a new word.
if somebody calls you a Sambo, that's what they're talking about.
This is where this came from. Damn, okay. I just learned something just now.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Let me see. It says, we might have also considered the extenuating circumstances that were Sambo's daily lived reality. Sambo might have thought that if he were more similar to his captors by adapting their religion, then perhaps his humility would be more plain to see. Humanity would be more plain to see.
Mhm.
But the labor and financial incentives of Barbados' proto-capitalist economy were enough to render the question moot. That is, if Ligon was even thinking about it at all. In any case, no indentured servant ever needed to seek recognition of their humanity in the same way that Sambo did. The primary source repeatedly refers to them as Christians, their national origins irrelevant and often omitted. The ultimate question of whether African enslavement in the Caribbean was caused by racism or capitalism, or one growing out of the other, it is a complex one and beyond the bounds of this thesis. Even though slaves lived in Europe, the European colonizers of the Americas, Portugal, Spain, France, England, Holland, were slave-holding societies in Europe and were not dependent on slavery at home.
Bullshit. That's
time.
bullshit.
Big time.
That's straight crap.
Big
But
time.
that is the biggest lie that she's told in this thesis
That's the
altogether.
biggest one. Hey, we take
Because-
this with the greatest of.
Because honestly, that trade, even in goods, has not stopped today. Europeans depend on import from the United States today. And it's been like that since the transatlantic slave trade and the practice of African slavery. For her to say that is not, is bullcrap.
It is. It definitely is.
No.
That's bunch of baloney.
They were dependent on it. And inherently, when she says here, let me go back here, where she says that, where are we at?
The very about what were slave.
Where she said the ultimate question of whether African enslavement in the Caribbean was caused by racism or capitalism, or one growing one of the other, is a complex one and beyond the bounds of this thesis. No, it's very simple.
Right.
It's very simple. They found a group of people that they found inferior, that they think were inferior, and they found that black skin and said, "We will enslave them.
Right.
We will treat them with inhumanity." That's what it is.
Right.
They just used it for capitalism. Not only can we enslave these people, we can use them for capitalism.
Right.
For her to say that it's it's not that complex.
Right.
It's not at all complex.
Exactly.
Don't give them an out.
Exactly. Broke that down to a T. Yeah, I feel you, big bro. All praise to the Most High. So we're gonna go down where it says white slavery on the next page.
I want to read this one.
You know, read that one.
Let me read this
I got
one.
you.
White slavery. White people could not be taken as slaves. Class over. Class is done.
In the lesson.
In the lesson.
In the lesson.
White people could not be taken as slaves. As discussed above, it was their labor that was bought and sold by planters, not their freedom. They had rights,
Right.
and it was not permitted under English law for them to be enslaved. In the summer of 1667, a soldier named William Harwin was one of a group of young people who were taken without consent aboard a ship named Conquer, which was about to sail away from London, bound for the West Indies. Upon learning what was transpiring on Conquer, the lieutenant of the Tower of London, Sir John Barkstead, was dispatched to the ship to investigate whether there were any more people aboard who were not of their own volition. And his remit specifically included people who were under indenture.
Right.
The terms of their contracted service were to be checked by Barkstead to make sure that they had not been kidnapped or otherwise coerced by the crew of the Conquer.
Right.
Of Conquer. If Sir John found anyone there against their will, he was under orders to release them at once.
Where? Look at here. That was their laws. Their law protected them. No laws protected us. There's a distinction. They had a appointed person. What was his name? Sir John Barkstead, whatever. To go onto a ship and specifically check to see if anyone was on that ship involuntarily thrown to be an indentured servant. Involuntarily.
The next line. The implications here are clear. An indentured servant could not be treated like a slave, and the bounds of their indenture must be respected.
Damn.
Their contract needs to be respected. They're not slaves.
They're not.
You're not slaves. It's not the same thing. The young lady, even though she messed up a little bit in here, has shown they're not the same.
Right. They're not. They cannot be, white people could not be slaves. Their contract had to be respected. There was a person appointed to go and ensure that these people were not being treated as slaves. I mean, that's like you said. That's the end of the class.
The next paragraph. When he liberated William Harwin from the decks of the Conquer, Sir John was following the letter of English law. It was one thing for a colonial assembly across the ocean to pass an ordinance differentiating between indentured servant and a slave. But in 1664, the Council for Foreign Plantations made a report 20 articles long to the English Parliament entitled "Certain Propositions for the better accommodating the foreign plantations with servants." That was a long-ass name. In this report, the Council for Foreign Plantation categorized servants in two types, white and black. At first glance, this report seems to give a glimmer of truth to the myth, but the council's report then went on to exact specific definitions as to what constituted a servant and what constituted a slave.
This is what the law says. When I said earlier, it's going to set apart the difference between the slave and indentured servant, white and black. Go ahead, bro. What did it say?
It says the servants are classed under two heads, blacks and whites. Blacks bought by way of trade and sold about 20, I don't know what that is, 20 pounds, I guess, 20 whatever, a head. The most useful appurtenances of a plantation and perpetual servants.
Perpetual service. Perpetual is never ending. Perpetual. Okay.
It says, and I read that word wrong, it's appurtenances, whatever. The whites divers ways gathered up in England, in England, few from Ireland or Scotland transported at the rate of about 6, whatever that is, per head, are entertained by those to whom they are consigned, or are exchanged for commodities at different rates according to their condition or trade. After certain years, these are free to plant for themselves or to take wages for their service, and have the value of 10 something to begin planting for themselves.
Right.
Ways of obtaining these servants from felons condemned to death, sturdy beggars, gypsies, and other incorrigible rogues, poor and idle debauched persons. Above it says the above distinction in crystal clear. Well, there it is. That's into that one. The above distinction is crystal clear and is the final nail in the coffin of the Irish slaves myth.
Right.
Blacks are bought as perpetual servants. The council declined to use the word slave, even though it is clear that is what is meant.
Right.
And white servants recruited from Britain, Ireland are free to work with the exception of land or money at the end of their tenure, with the expectation of land or money at the end of their tenure.
Right. The expectation of land or money at the end of their tenure. Only thing we was promised was damn death.
So she summed it up right there.
She summed it up. I mean, she really doing all the talking for me. And that was pretty much the end and all I pretty much had to this. It's a lot of reading, y'all. It's a lot of reading. I mean, it kind of goes quick. When you just sip some coffee and just kind of, just go from there. But you can also, if you go to page 42, it's the conclusion of conclusion of everything. Did you want to read that?
No, let's read it.
Okay.
We'll read it.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if I'm gonna read all of it. That's like, we'll read it. We'll read it till you tell me to stop. Okay.
Okay.
It says, conclusion. Over the course of this thesis, a deep analysis of the primary sources within the calendar of state papers, colonial America and West Indies database has shown that the popular misconception known as the Irish slaves myth is a falsehood. These sources, did you get a picture of this lady? Is she Edom?
I didn't never look it up.
We should find her picture. These sources, coupled with the synthesis of secondary scholarship on the subject, has shown that indentured servants and enslaved people occupied two very different levels of 17th century Caribbean society. Using the sugar plantations of Barbados as our primary example, we have seen that even though both groups had close working relationships and did very similar work on the sugar plantations, they had very different rights under the law. This is one of the main focal points of the Irish slaves myth, that because both groups are essentially doing the same work, then it is a short, simple step to conflate them into one oppressed mass. I mean, yeah, it's easy to say that they were together because they did the same work. Yet the truth is that numerous laws existed to protect the rights of indentured servants in ways that a slave could only dream about. Even though most indentured servants on Barbados were Irish, their legal status was not that of a slave, nor could it ever be. Therefore, the conflation of servant and slave in books like To Hell or Barbados and White Cargo relies on a false equivalency that is not born out of the primary sources. As a final caveat, it must be noted that proponents of the myth occasionally bring up a legitimate primary source that refers to Irish servants on Barbados as slaves. This reference is from an anonymous observation, of course, of life on the island dated back in 1667, and it reads, not above 760 considerable proprietors and 8,000 effective men, of which 2/3 are of no reputation and little courage, and a very great part Irish derided by Negroes as white slaves. I guess that's what they're using. And indeed, except proprietors, merchants, tradesmen, officers, and their dependents, the rest are such as not have reason to discern their abuses or not the courage to leave the island or are in debt and cannot go. That's still not the same as a slave. Those spreading the myth could use a source like this to argue that since even the enslaved Africans were referring to the Irish as indentured servants, as fellow slaves, the myth must be true. And that's where I'm at.
Yeah. So this basically just brought out that, just to conclude along with what she said.
Were you looking her up?
So yeah.
I wanted to know if she was Edom or
I
not.
couldn't find the guy who looked. What did it say he did? The professor who advised it.
Mhm.
This is him right here.
Oh, he's Edom.
Yeah, weird looking. Sweet.
And what's her name?
Liam, Liam. Last name McKee, McKee.
Mhm. And that's who wrote this?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a female?
What's
What's the name of the article again?
Slaves to a Myth? Irish Indentured Servitude. Slaves to a Myth.
Let me see.
Mm-hmm.
See.
Now, if y'all are reading along, y'all would notice that there's numbers at the end of sentences. Again, those are, it leads you to references at the bottom of the page.
Yeah,
You know
yeah.
what I'm saying? So, if you ever have opportunity, go back and read it for yourselves, man. This is it. This literally has all the information which you can use to basically debunk anything someone says whenever they want to say.
And this is primarily for the Irish slave, because that's the ones that they'll talk about the most.
Right.
But you got other Edomite groups that will tell you that there was slave stuff going on, blah, 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 blah. The point of the matter is, and you can use this as much as you need to, that not only is it historically insignificant, if they have to bring some obscure battle, war, whatever it is, to try to conflate it with African slavery, ask them in what century it was and how long it was.
Mm-hmm.
This other guy that actually goes against, he makes great points against transgender people. He tried to start talking about teaching African history or African American history, that slavery needs to be taught differently because there were a whole bunch of other people in slavery too. That's the one that brought up the Islamic white slave trade, which,
Yeah.
when have you ever heard that?
I've never heard of that before. Never. I've never heard of that.
There has been an Islamic African slave trade.
Right. Sub-Saharan slave trade.
There it is. See, we even have a good name for it.
Exactly.
What was this other one he's talking about? There's no other one. There's no other one.
Yep.
Because the only way they can make themselves even half of worth what we are, they have to pull us down. They have to take our affliction and say, you really didn't have an affliction. It's ridiculous. And don't play into that nonsense.
Exactly. Exactly. So, just some more stuff to add to your toolbox, man. Study it, learn it, bind it, seal it in your hearts. That way, anytime they come up against you, man, you have to have a conversation about it. You're equipped. You've been taught. You learned. Now you're a scholar on the matter. And we'll proceed. Anybody have anything they'd like to add to it? Any questions about it? Anything at all?
Sorry about making us late again. We gonna keep it going. Next week I won't be here, but the week after I'm gonna make sure I know what I'm doing. I don't know why this light ain't working. This light should have been working. I'm mad about that light right there.
Yeah, I know exactly.
But this should be a good signal here.
Let me see. Okay. But if ain't nobody got anything, we say shalom to Esau. You a pervert. You
Stop.
disgusting.
Knock it off, Nick.
to Ishmael and Elam. Your music sucks.
It's bad. Horrible music. Your music is garbage. He come out swinging. All right, we know what this. You are the devil the Bible speaks of. You like little boys and girls.
Oh man!
Stop.
And everything that come out of your mouth is a fallacy.
Yeah, we
stop. Be ready for the judgment.
Edom is. Hey, there is no hope for Edom.
None. And the Most High has a perpetual hatred against you. Sorry, not sorry. But Revelation 13:10, right, says that those who led in captivity shall go into captivity, and we're sitting here waiting patiently for that day, right? We are the Hebrew Israelites. Love y'all. Thank y'all. Shalom.
Shalom.